Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 30 Minutes with a Modern Mystic. It's been a while, but here we are again. And my name is Sascha, and this is Michael, and we welcome you.
Hi. Yeah, we had to play a little bit of COVID. We've all had a turn.
Yeah, right.
And I think it probably affected me the least, but there we go. I'm not sure.
Wonderful.
And yeah, so here we are, and we're talking COVID. We're talking the power of vulnerability.
That's the topic we just came up with.
And vulnerability, in some ways, and I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek, vulnerability is some ways not having the jab. There is a vulnerability there, but there's also a trust that your body does have an adequate immune system and that we wouldn't be alive in 2022 if that immune system wasn't efficient enough to get us through all the ages that precede this. Okay, I realize it's not the same body, but it's the same soul, the same person.
I think in many ways, vulnerability or being able to be vulnerable goes back to accepting death, not as a threat, but as just something that is something we have to go through in every lifetime, right? Once you do that, you're open to becoming vulnerable, because I think
vulnerable and open go hand in hand, obviously. But I really find that the word death that we use is so pointing in the wrong direction. It's such a negative term.
It is.
Because it is a transition from metaphysical and physical to purely metaphysical. And then there's another transition we call birth, but the soul coming back into once again taking on physical and metaphysical. And we call them death and birth, but they should really both be seen as a transition into and out of.
Right. So would you agree to my insight or observation just now that as long as you're afraid of death, or as long as you somehow cling very much to that specific identity body that you're in now, it's very difficult to accept vulnerability or to be vulnerable for yourself. But once you let go of that attachment, it's like, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen?
I think, vulnerability is a choice. You sort of have to choose to put down the defenses. I mean, I've noticed, and it was in me as well, that people have an automatic psychic defense system placed pretty much over the whole solar plexus. And I've often been asked, when you do public speaking, how do you protect yourself? Well, obviously, they've never heard me say that there's nothing outside of self. So obviously, there'll be nothing to protect myself from, but they genuinely mean it. And I've had some very nice meaning psychics tell me of all sorts of ways to protect myself. And I always say to them, I choose to be vulnerable. And in my vulnerability, I have had what I would call a sort of psychic parasite attached to my solar plexus and sucked far more energy out of me than I was prepared to give on that day. But and said at the end, I got more out of you than I expected. He actually said that. And I said, you got more out of me than I expected. But on the other hand, at the end of the day, I went home with friends to their place, and I had a nice long hot shower, and I had a good meal, and I was as right as rain again. So I was back to normal. But I remember choosing to be vulnerable in a time when a lot of people were saying it's not a good idea. And since then, it's never really happened at all. A vulnerability carries its own energy field. Vulnerability is an energy. What we forget is these words describe energies. Trust is not a word. It's one of the most powerful energies available to humanity. And vulnerability is in a like way. It describes an energy, but by becoming vulnerable, you become one with that energy. And that energy is very self-protective, yet you're vulnerable and unprotected. It's a paradox, really.
I guess
And
I guess for me, the reason that I brought up death or fear of death before, and the reason why I see it connected or intertwined with this whole topic of vulnerability is that for most people, for most of us, if you're in a state of being afraid of opening up to be vulnerable, then if you ask yourself, okay, what am I afraid of? What's the worst thing that can happen? It's death. You know, I mean, that's the ultimate worst thing that can happen in that state of fear, right? There's nothing really, nothing more fear-provoking for most people than death. So I think that choice to be vulnerable, ultimately, that's why I see it so connected, because if you're not afraid of death anymore, if you just see death as a tradition, I think as a transition, I find it quite easy to just be vulnerable because, okay, I mean, there's nothing really to be afraid of. That's why I see this connection, but not sure of that.
well, most of our Western religions have done a good job to teach people to fear death and retribution and judgment. God will judge, etc., etc. And a lot of people don't really want to be there when that judgment happens. Right. I think it was Woody Allen who said, it's not death I mind so much, it's the idea of dying.
I like
and
that.
That would probably sum it up for a whole lot of people. Afterwards, it's not a problem. But I honestly, for me, death is such a non-event, I've become so completely aware of the transition. I found myself, I think I was laying in the bath, in actual fact, about 4 nights ago, laying in the bath, having a nice hot soak. And I thought to myself, death would feel like this. It'd be like having a long hot bath and soak, except you don't get out the bath. And I thought, God, that would be beautiful. What a lovely thing. You just close your eyes and away you go. I thought, you know, I sort of sent a message, anytime, it's okay with me. And I sort of got the feeling you'll be lucky, so I don't think it's about to happen anytime soon. But I was so aware of how completely I'm unafraid of that. So when I think of vulnerability, death doesn't immediately come to mind. I think of things like public speaking. I think of something like this, being online, no idea who's listening to you and what they're thinking about you or what
Right.
they're saying about you and the discussion that could be going on in the room.
Right.
I mean, look at him.
I mean, I agree.
He waves his hands around, he pulls faces, he laughs. He's supposed to be a spiritual teacher. You have no idea of that. And with that vulnerability, you're okay, you're fine.
I mean, I agree that on a maybe more superficial level, the moments that we think of, should I be vulnerable or not, are much more related to maybe shame and these type of things, or blame, shame, and whatnot. But I think on a deeper level, really, if you ask yourself the question, what could I be? What's the worst thing that can happen? What could I be afraid of? I mean, like if I have an image about myself, if I have this public standing, if I have all my life that is in danger, if I become vulnerable, then if I ask the question, okay, what is that life? What is that identity? What is that? It's all a construct, and it all goes away when I die anyhow. So right. So that whole fear of or what are they going to think about me, blah 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 blah, then just kind of disappears the moment that you accept, okay, I'm going to leave this body anyhow, and that Sascha is going to transition into something else anyhow. So why should I be afraid of what people think of Sascha? Why should I be afraid of what I think of? You know, I could just be open to whatever life presents to me.
Well, that's the ultimate key, is what you think. What other people think is none of our business. It's what we think of ourselves. And that's where real vulnerability really begins, that you're vulnerable to yourself.
Right.
And you don't have to answer to yourself. You feel okay. You do the best you can in life on a daily basis. You do your best to have pure, clean and worthy thoughts, and the rest you just let it be. It's okay. I can remember when I first started doing retreats first, then they evolved into intensives after Trini died. But I remember with the retreats,
because you're such an intense person.
I would have a lot of written material with me and a lot
I
of
remember
jokes.
that.
So, yeah, so if anybody got unhappy, I could read a joke. But gradually, I can remember gradually, it's like I referred to myself as a tightrope walker. And I had a net and a balancing pole. And the time came when I felt that I really didn't need the net. And so all the written material just dropped away. And I remembered many of the inner exercises, and I could create more. And one day I realized I was still hanging on to the balancing pole. And interestingly enough, the year after Trini died, I let go of that. And I just decided I don't need the balancing pole anymore or the net. And so I became far more vulnerable to people. However, that came after unconditional love for myself. And I realized in looking back, there was no accident there. With that loving yourself, you don't judge or criticize or condemn. You just accept yourself for who you are. And that's when I no longer needed the pole, the big pole to keep my balance on the tightrope.
They were probably based on your insecurity that you still had
absolutely.
from your childhood, where people said you're not clever, blah, blah, blah. And then when you gave those courses, you had this inner voice saying, oh, I might not be good enough. I need these documents as a backup, something like that, maybe, right?
It's a bit like the conditioning, the subconscious thoughts are, I was the class dunce. I had two others for company, but the three of us we kept in the bottom, and that was not just 1 year, that was all the way through school. I look back and realize it was a very left brain dominant intellectual school, and I was a very right brain dominant child. And so to me, it's like, what are they talking about? I just didn't get it. I lost the plot on day one, I think. And so you tend to condemn yourself a bit. You tend to agree with the assessment of the school, but the time comes when you know you're better than that. And yet, even though you know you're better, the program can still keep running along in the subconscious trickle until finally you become conscious enough that the subconscious trickle gradually ebbs away. And I don't have those sort of thoughts anymore. But that's a long process. And I honestly believe that vulnerability is a strong, big step on that path of spiritual growth.
I agree. I think it's paramount. It's really important, because if you look at all our society, our cultural values, it's all designed in a way to make us very protective of our own image in a very sick way. And vulnerability kind of throws all that off in a way, like you suddenly, it gives you a pathway through all this nonsense that we have been conditioned with.
It's like there's outside control. During my time of travel, I realized that a lot of people, male and female, when I say a lot, of course they're the minority, but many of them were strongly into controlling their lives, and therefore controlling the lives of people they loved. And it didn't take me long to realize that they were very insecure and had very insecure childhoods. Right. And so they didn't want that to happen anymore. And therefore they took control and felt that that was an expression of love to the people in their families. Right. And I often talk to them of vulnerability. And I can remember some of them were absolutely horrified. But if I'm vulnerable, I'm out of control.
I think it's pretty scary for so many people who are used to being in control, because ultimately, I mean, this fear of vulnerability goes back to a lack of self-love, if you think about it.
Of course, of course. I mean, everything goes back to
everything goes back to it, but vulnerability,
negative.
Yeah, but I think
everything that's negative goes back to that.
it's
And in a
true.
way, to be vulnerable is to become powerful and confident and free.
Yep.
Because whatever life serves,
Nothing
I'm
can happen to
okay.
you. Yep.
That's right. It's a lovely feeling. I mean, people used to say to me, "Don't you fear COVID?" I'd say, "What's there to fear? If the COVID is going to come to me, it will come to me. If it isn't, it won't. And if it does come, I'll deal with it." And personally, I don't expect it to, because I've looked after myself. I've got my energy and COVID. I don't think they go together for a lasting relationship. It might be brief. See ya.
A one night stand.
Thanks for the immune system boost, but that's about all.
By the way, I just had a great idea before. If you, while being in your bathtub, transition into some other realm, then I just rename this format into 30 minutes without a modern mystic. And I'll just keep talking and I'll just have your empty room there.
Yeah, that'd be a good one, wouldn't it? Who knows? Let's wait and see. You'd have to have a bathtub in a room.
Okay,
with
I'll ask
nobody
Carolyn for a
sitting in it.
picture.
With nobody sitting in it.
Yeah.
And people say, "Are you having a conversation with a bathtub?" Well, yes, spin away. Okay, this is getting ridiculous.
So,
And that's nice to be vulnerable on online, to be ridiculous and be vulnerable in that way.
yeah,
Because a lot of people are very careful to be creditable, you know, that you wouldn't think they're ridiculous. I mean, in the time of Louis the XVI, ridicule was a weapon. And they would pick on maybe one of the people in the French court of the king's court, and they'd pick on him and ridicule him, and eventually that person would commit suicide. Ridicule was a weapon, and I think they once showed a movie to that effect. I didn't see it. I felt it was something I didn't want to see. But when you're vulnerable, ridicule is.
and most of what we see on TV, most of what we see in the movies, basically wants to suggest to us that we have to maintain that image of being somebody different, maybe, than that vulnerable, open person that we could be, just so that other people can think certain things of us. That's like all the movies, whatever we see on the media, not everything these days, but most of it, and all the classic stuff for sure, is trying to push us into that corner of no, you can't be who you really are. You can't be open and vulnerable. You have to pretend something in order to get social acceptance.
You've got to project an image that is socially accepted, even if it isn't you. And
Yep.
particularly children. Yep. You know, there are the media could sort of make a child so unhappy that they'll suicide at the age of 7.
Oh, I haven't heard that, but it sounds horrible.
It's happening, and you think, my God, what sort of children would do that? And they think that's funny.
But I feel like we've come to a point of the furthest externalization possible in terms of like how far can you project your happiness outwards, and everything that would be important, like projected onto things outside of yourself. And now it has to come back inward again. Now we're at the point where I think it's going to move backwards, because I can hardly imagine how it could be projected further outwards. Like from an early age, we're training every child mostly that everything you're looking for is out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's always that. And success was out there.
Yeah.
And all that stupid idea. But I do my best not to, but occasionally if I'm going to look at the news, I see some of our ads. And our ads definitely suggest we're an insane society.
Oh, definitely. Not only our ads.
I mean, it's not funny. It is so stupid. It is so inane. It is such tripe that there's nothing that they advertise that I'd ever consider buying. I would think, if that is your consciousness, no, thank you. I don't want it. And
kind of like embracing vulnerability breaks that shell that artificial shell that has been put in place for so many generations of conditioning, because suddenly you see like a beam of light of what could be a way of constantly evolving through just opening up and say, okay, I might be wrong, you might be wrong, I might be right, whatever, but I'm just going to accept whatever life throws at me to grow.
I would love to see a newscaster vulnerable enough to say to the people, you know, all these things I have to say to you, but I'd like to say from my heart, if you choose love, that will be the greatest aid you can give yourself, the greatest asset, the greatest component of your immune system. Why don't you be more loving and kind and gentle with yourself and other people? Never heard it yet. It's not written in newspapers. And you wonder, do people not know this? But no, there's a conspiracy to keep us in a state of fear, which is non-vulnerability. So we're very, very vulnerable. And many people don't recognize that. I mean, once you move into vulnerability, then all that, you just look at it and it's a joke. It's like, it's just something funny.
I agree.
And yet for many people, vulnerability spells deep anxiety.
Yeah, because you're afraid that you might lose something. And that's
so therefore you've got to defend yourself, control the environment, scrub your hands until they're sterile, and we're in some interesting times.
But after all, what I guess what one is afraid of losing is when you get to that realization that what you're afraid of losing is just that construct, a mixture of your own fears that have been maybe instilled in you, and then all this social conditioning. It's like you see this artificial dome around you and suddenly, oh, there's a door, I can walk out and I don't need to be in here anymore.
I guess yes, yeah. It's like you're talking like of a change of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a change of consciousness.
If the world embraced being vulnerable, disease would nearly come to an end.
Everything would be different.
Everything would be completely different, just a vulnerability.
So
yet we're encouraged to defend ourselves more than ever, through vaccines and through
and I think also to whoever is in charge, and we're not even getting into this now, but to whoever is in charge or wants to be in charge of humanity, it is vital and very instrumental to utilize this false security mindset to keep people in a state of permanent defense or permanent need for defense. You know, it's the war, it's this disease, it's whatever. There's like a constant
permanent anxiety.
You need to maintain them in permanent anxiety, so that they permanently feel the need to be outwardly showing like secure, or look for security in news, in whatever it is, in jobs, in money, in relationships. You have to do everything you can to avoid them looking for that security in themselves.
It's interesting, in a way, everything we've been talking about is metaphysical.
Yeah.
Because the body is just, we sit and talk, and our bodies walk around and do things during the day. But everything we think, all our emotions, all our fear, all our vulnerability, everything, that's all metaphysical. And so vulnerability is a very powerful metaphysical movement toward a greater freedom, whereas fear is a metaphysical movement toward greater control and greater anxiety, which leads to greater illness.
Also, in my experience, vulnerability is a very down-to-earth and practical doorstep to spiritual growth. Like, it's not as abstract as choose love, for example. If you talk to someone and say, okay, choose love, then they're going to ask, what does it mean? And it's much more difficult to grasp. But vulnerability, it's very easy to understand. Like, okay, you need to open up and question everything you might think about yourself, or you might want other people to think about yourself, and just be open.
Yeah, it's an openness and with no reservations. You just become open to life, what life presents, what life takes away. Like just before my birthday, the day before my birthday, I often talk of birthdays start and end a cycle. And so when you have a birthday, it's time to let go of what is no longer appropriate in your life, rather than hang on to it. And so you go another cycle and you get to the end. And the day before this birthday, this my 85th birthday, my kidneys told me it was time for me to stop eating fried bacon. And man, do I like fried bacon. And so I said to Max, my body elemental, that would be an interesting subject. I talked, the body elemental. And I said to him, I said, Max, I said, if you think I should give it up, I will give it up, because you're the one on the spot. And so I basically haven't eaten bacon since, and probably won't. I certainly won't buy any. But, and Carolyn, when she had the lump, and she quit wine suddenly after almost a whole lifetime of alcohol, which was mostly in the form of wine, but in bad times, which she didn't have when she married to me, a bit of vodka. But anyway, she just quit alcohol in one go. And that was about 2 weeks before her birthday. And it's interesting when you look at those things, and somehow when you become vulnerable to life, those intuitive moments are very strong. When you're full of anxiety and in control, you ignore those intuitive things. But when you're vulnerable, those intuitive things, as much, instead of a whisper, it's almost like a loud voice saying, sorry, bacon time's come to an end. And I thought, well, I know what it tastes like. I've had about 80 years of experience of it, so I know what it tastes like. Okay, let go. Just as simple as that.
I agree. And when we ignore these intuitive things, as you called them, my feeling is that that's when we make space for accidents, severe illnesses, weird things that hit us.
Yeah, I think vulnerability is in fact the most impregnable form of protection there is, to be completely vulnerable.
Also,
I mean, the more vulnerable you become, the more invulnerable you are. How's that for a beautiful paradox?
It's a great, beautiful paradox. And I think also it's the best protection against your own karma you could possibly have, because you're always open to instantly dissolve anything that through your intuition you feel like, oh, that's maybe out of place, or oh, that was wrong, and you're just open to it. And
in other words, vulnerability is your doorway to the moment, and you hold the door open.
Let's use a couple, we might have a couple more minutes to, as we always do, to maybe talk about practical ways, easy steps into vulnerability. Maybe if you feel you're trapped into in a situation where it's very difficult for you to let go of whoever you think you need to be, what would you suggest?
I would say that anyone who has insecurity, deep insecurity and anxiety, is very, therefore has many fears. And I would suggest that maybe for an hour a day, you practice conscious vulnerability. So you put aside an hour, which you consider might be a safe one, like lunch hour, and you just become vulnerable to the moment, to the people, to what's happening. And you, as much as possible, you're conscious of being vulnerable. There's no such thing as subconscious vulnerability. There's no such thing as subconscious trust. There's no such thing as subconscious love. So anything that has meaning has to be conscious. And I remind people of this by using the word conscious. So conscious vulnerability for maybe an hour a day. And if that feels comfortable, then after a month of it, extend it to 3 hours a day. And after another month, maybe do a morning or an afternoon. And just gradually work your way into becoming more vulnerable and actually being conscious enough to notice how your life is changing for the better.
What would it mean in practical terms in that hour, 1 hour of vulnerability? What would change? What would you do differently to give people some very practical?
Well, I think, for instance, if somebody came up to you and started a conversation and you really didn't agree with what they're saying, instead of arguing back, you would just decide, okay, I'll listen. And you would listen not closed, because you can't listen closed. You would listen with an openness, and you don't have to discuss it with them or argue a case or, yes, I agree. You just say to them, well, that was interesting. I'll think about this, and do just that. Think about it, and you might suddenly find, wow, I wouldn't have listened to that, but actually that made a lot of sense. It feels good in my heart. So that's one simple way that you could use it practically, because people will come up when you're really vulnerable, and you'll find vulnerability attracts the more positive, caring, loving people. It doesn't really attract the negative, nasty types, unless it is in your interest that you have something to grow through by being challenged and be vulnerable throughout that process.
It's kind of like the harder your shell, the more you attract tough hammers to break it.
That's right. That's right. The harder we say in Australia, the 4x2 approach, the tougher the nut, the bigger the lump of wood that has to hit it.
Right. Karma in a nutshell.
The karma in a nutshell. Vulnerability. So be vulnerable. Think about it and give yourself a little practice sessions, unless you are a vulnerable person. And if so, well, that's wonderful. Vulnerability, allow vulnerability to make you invulnerable.
What a better ending could we have? Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thanks everyone who listened to us. And of course,
I will be vulnerable and say to you all, I love you, because I mean it.
Make sure to hit the thumbs up button underneath if you liked the video. Share the video, share the channel, subscribe to the channel. You know the game. See you in the next episode.
Bye. Thanks, Sascha.